My stepmother, Eleanor, orchestrated my removal from my father's obituary, but as the co-trustee of his estate, I systematically dismantled her plans for his fortune. This act of defiance led to a shocking discovery, and 2 years later, she stood in a courtroom, found guilty on 14 separate counts of unspeakable crimes. Eleanor had barred me from my own father's funeral and attempted to erase my very existence from his final public record. In response, I ensured she would never touch a single cent of his inheritance. I was only 14 when my father, a kind but conflict-averse man, married her. Eleanor was the very picture of a woman who tossed around terms like networking at cocktail parties and referred to her manicurist as her personal therapist. On the surface, she was a symphony of perfectly calibrated smiles and the lingering scent of a high-end perfume that seemed to announce her arrival. But behind the closed doors of our home, Eleanor was a meticulous gatekeeper, controlling access to attention, to affection, and ultimately to my father himself. When Dad married her, she preached about the importance of blending our families. What she actually meant was that I, his only child, should blend seamlessly into the wallpaper. She came with 2 adult children from a previous marriage, Dorian and Lyra, who were both perpetually loud, profoundly entitled, and seemingly allergic to any form of manual labor. Eleanor made it her life's mission to ensure their every whim and need was prioritized above all else. If Dad slipped me $50 for a school field trip, she would sigh dramatically and remark, "Must be nice. My children never received handouts like that." The irony was that they received them constantly. If Dad had scheduled a weekend fishing trip with me, a sudden and unexpected family emergency on her side would invariably materialize, demanding his immediate presence. By the time I turned 18, our relationship had been eroded down to fleeting phone calls and the occasional, stilted lunch, which Eleanor was always mysteriously too busy to attend. Then, 2 years ago, my father fell ill. It wasn't the kind of sickness from which you recover. I found out through my cousin, Ava, not from Eleanor, who I later learned claimed she didn't want to worry me. By the time I rushed to the hospital, she had already established an ironclad regime, dictating who could visit, at what times, and for precisely how long. I was allotted a few hours each week, but only under her watchful supervision. When I tried to ask Dad about this arrangement, he would just let out a weary sigh and say, "Let's not make things harder than they have to be." That was his lifelong method of avoiding confrontation, but I could see the truth in his tired eyes. He wanted me there. A few months later, the inevitable call came. Dad was gone. I wept until my chest ached with a hollow pain. Then I gathered myself and asked about the funeral arrangements. Eleanor's voice over the phone was as cold and sharp as glass when she declared, "I don't think it would be appropriate for you to be there." For a moment, I was certain I had misheard her. "I'm his daughter," I stammered. "And I'm his wife," she retorted, her voice dripping with venom. "This is going to be a private ceremony for the people who were actually a part of his life." My breath caught in my throat. "I am a part of his life." "Not in any way that matters," she snapped before the line went dead. I drove to her house that night, fueled by a white-hot rage, but she refused to answer the door. The next day I tried again. Still nothing. Finally, I called her from a blocked number. She answered with that syrupy sweet, phony tone she reserved for strangers. But the moment she recognized my voice, her own turned to ice. "If you show up," she warned, "I will have security escort you out." I didn't truly believe she would sink so low until I saw the obituary online. My name was nowhere to be found. It listed her children, Dorian and Lyra, as his cherished surviving family, but it left me out as if I had never existed. I cannot articulate the profound agony of that moment. It wasn't just about losing my father anymore. It was about being systematically erased from his life story, while his body was barely cold. So, on the day of the funeral, I stayed home. I sat on my couch, clutching one of Dad's old, worn flannel shirts, trying to breathe through the suffocating waves of grief and fury. But as the hours ticked by, something inside me shifted. A cold clarity washed over me. I realized that if she could cut me out of my final goodbye, then I could just as easily cut her out of the luxurious little world she had so carefully constructed for herself. This is where the backstory becomes crucial. My father had always been a prudent man with his finances. He had a will, which he had updated shortly after marrying Alina. She, of course, assumed she would inherit everything. She was catastrophically wrong. Dad had left me a 50% share of their home, along with co-control over a small trust fund designated for property taxes and essential upkeep. I had never acted on this while Dad was alive, partly out of respect for him and partly to avoid igniting a war with Alina. But after she denied me the right to attend his funeral, the gloves came off entirely. Within a week, I was sitting in a lawyer's office. We went over the deed and the trust documents line by line. Legally, Alina could not sell or refinance the house without my explicit written consent. She couldn't even undertake major renovations without my approval. Furthermore, I served as a co-trustee for the fund. That meant any expenditure she requested had to be approved and paid through me. I didn't contact her at first. I simply began to exercise my rights quietly and methodically. She submitted plans to remodel the kitchen. They were denied. She wanted to host a lavish Christmas party. I required her to purchase an expensive event insurance policy for any gathering exceeding 20 people, which she couldn't afford. She requested funds from the trust to pay for professional landscaping. I approved it, but only on the condition that she used the budget-friendly service I selected. At first, she tried to ignore my stipulations. Then, she attempted to charm me, a tactic that had long since lost its power. When that failed, she exploded, screaming over the phone, accusing me of trying to ruin her life. I calmly reminded her, I'm simply protecting my father's assets. You know, the man whose funeral you banned me from. It took her less than 6 months to put the house on the market. She couldn't stand living in a home where she had to ask my permission to so much as paint a wall. When the house sold, I received my half of the proceeds, a sum large enough for a down payment on my own place. The sweetest part was that word of her actions had begun to circulate through our extended family. She thought she had controlled the narrative, but people started asking questions about why I hadn't been at the funeral. I told them the unvarnished truth. Now, she's the one who is conspicuously unwelcome at family gatherings. I never got to say a proper goodbye to my father, and I will carry the scar of that forever. But every time I unlock the front door to the house I purchased with the money she was convinced she would keep, I feel my dad smiling, knowing that I didn't let her win. Just when I thought the saga had concluded, a call from the hospital revealed the horrifying truth about my father's final days. I was unpacking boxes in my new living room when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Maria Sanchez, a nurse who had worked in the intensive care unit where Dad passed away. Her voice was thick with emotion as she told me she could no longer stay silent about what she had witnessed. My fingers trembled so violently that I had to set down the picture frame I was holding. She was reluctant to say more over the phone, insisting we meet in person at a discreet coffee shop called Neutral Grounds, located about 20 minutes from the hospital. My mind raced with 1,000 terrifying possibilities, but I agreed to meet her the following morning. I didn't sleep at all that night, replaying every last memory from Dad's final days. The next morning, as I walked into Neutral Grounds, a woman in her 40s with weary, haunted eyes motioned me toward a corner booth. A manila folder sat on the table in front of her, and she kept her hand resting on it, as if afraid someone might snatch it away. Before I could even sit, she pushed the folder toward me and urged me to look at Dad's medication logs from his last week. The documents inside detailed dose after dose of powerful pain medication, each one progressively higher than the last, and none of them aligning with what his primary doctors had prescribed. On every authorization form, serving as his medical proxy, was Aliner's signature. The notes revealed that my father's morphine levels had tripled in a mere 3 days, even though his overall condition had been showing signs of improvement. Maria leaned in, her voice a low whisper, and explained how she had tried to raise her concerns with the hospital administrator, a doctor named Adrian Vance, but he had dismissed her entirely and promptly changed her shift schedule so she would no longer be assigned to Dad's room. She then revealed that 3 other elderly patients, for whom Aliner had also acted as a proxy, had exhibited the same pattern. They all passed away within weeks, leaving behind substantial estates. A cold dread washed over me as I realized this was so much bigger than just my father. After leaving the coffee shop, I sat in my car in the parking garage for a full 20 minutes, unable to even turn the key in the ignition. My hands shaking, I called Rowan Hayes, my estate attorney, and left a frantic voicemail demanding urgent legal advice regarding the circumstances of my father's death. The concrete walls of the garage seemed to close in on me as I tried to process the monstrous possibility that Aliner had murdered my father. Rowan called me back within the hour, the alarm evident in his voice as I recounted what Maria had shown me. He instructed me to document everything, make copies of every single paper, and to immediately file a formal complaint with the state medical board. When he asked if I was prepared for the reality that Aliner could face murder charges, I answered yes without a single moment of hesitation. I spent the entire weekend at my kitchen table, organizing medication logs and creating a timeline of my father's final days with a chaotic spread of sticky notes and highlighters. Every small detail I remembered about Aliner's behavior suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. Her insistence on being alone with the doctors, her tight control over who received updates on his condition. The way she used to hover over the nurses as they administered his medication now seemed less like concern, and more like she was ensuring her instructions were followed to the letter. 2 days later, my cousin Ava called me out of the blue, saying she'd heard from other relatives that I was asking questions about the funeral. She said she had something I needed to see and asked if she could come over immediately. When she arrived, she pulled out her phone and played an audio recording she had discreetly made at the funeral reception while Aliner was outside taking a phone call. Eleanor's voice was crystal clear, assuring someone on the other end that the situation was handled and that the estate would be cleared up soon. Ava thought it was strange at the time, but didn't think much of it until she heard I was investigating. I immediately called Rowan and met him at his office the next morning with all the evidence we had gathered. He had already pulled the estate records and discovered that Eleanor had filed paperwork to expedite probate just 2 days after the funeral, a move he found alarmingly swift for someone supposedly in the throes of grief. The timeline of it all, the medication changes, the rushed probate filing, the clandestine phone call at the funeral, it all pointed to a plan that Eleanor had been hatching for months. That evening, Maria called, telling me that Dr. Vance had been questioning other nurses about her, asking if she had spoken to anyone about past patients. That medication log reveal made me wonder what Eleanor's real strategy was here. The timing of those dosage increases appeared particularly handy for someone who was already measuring the kitchen for improvements. She was terrified he would discover she had contacted me and was unsure what to do. I urged her to act normally and go to work as if nothing had happened. While Rowan prepared the formal complaints for the medical board and the district attorney's office, I needed to clear my head. I drove to Riverside Park, the place where Dad used to take me fishing every Saturday morning before Eleanor came into our lives. The wooden benches were slick with frost, but I sat down anyway, staring out at the frozen pond where we used to catch bluegill and talk about everything except what truly mattered. I remembered the last time I saw him lucid enough to talk. It was 2 weeks before he died. He grabbed my hand and started to say something about Eleanor, but then he stopped himself, just squeezing my hand harder. His eyes held a look I couldn't decipher at the time, but I now recognized it as a mixture of fear and guilt. He knew something was deeply wrong, but no longer had the strength to fight it. A week later, my phone rang at 2 in the morning. I almost didn't answer the unknown number. It was Dorian. His voice was slurred and aggressive as he ranted about his mother acting erratically since the funeral. He said she had been burning papers in their backyard fire pit all week and kept making hushed phone calls to a man named Adrian at all hours. I put my phone on record as he rambled on about finding shredded financial documents in the trash and overhearing her yelling at someone about not sticking to the plan. He repeated Adrian's name 3 more times before hanging up abruptly, and the sound of him being sick. Rowan filed the formal complaint with the medical board 2 days later, including Maria's medication logs and the audio recording from the funeral. The board sent back a form letter stating they had opened an investigation that would take a minimum of 60 to 90 days for an initial review. I wanted to scream at the slow pace, but Rowan cautioned me that building an airtight case takes time. The next afternoon, my phone rang, and the screen displayed Eleanor's number for the first time since she had barred me from Dad's funeral. Her voice was dripping with synthetic sweetness as she asked how I was doing, adding that she'd heard through the grapevine that I'd been asking questions about Dad's care. She said she didn't want to see me getting worked up over conspiracy theories when I should be focused on healing and moving on. The threat hung in the air between us. I remained silent, letting her reveal more with each carefully chosen, menacing word. She added that Dr. Vance was concerned I was harassing his staff, and that perhaps I needed professional help to process my grief properly. I said nothing, and she eventually hung up after telling me that spreading lies about good people has consequences. Maria texted me to meet at a downtown Starbucks the next morning. She slid another manila folder across the table. Inside were printouts from a charity website, showing Alina and Adrian Vance serving on the same hospital foundation board 15 years prior, long before Dad had even met her. There were gala photos of them standing close together, smiling, and donor lists showing they had co-sponsored several events over the years. Maria then showed me a newspaper clipping about that same foundation being investigated for financial irregularities. The investigation had been dropped, but Alina had resigned from the board right before it started. Looking me dead in the eye, Maria said, "This wasn't a coincidence. I think your father was targeted from the very beginning." The following week, Rowan called me into his office. He had property records spread across his conference table like a timeline of desperation. Alina had attempted to refinance Dad's house 3 separate times in the year before he died, but each application had been rejected because the trust required my signature. The loan amounts she requested grew each time, starting at $200,000 and ending at $500,000. The final application was submitted just 2 weeks before Dad was admitted to the hospital for what was supposed to be a routine procedure. Rowan pointed to the denial letters, each one citing the trust's structure, the very structure that protected my inheritance, as the primary obstacle. My apartment felt suffocatingly quiet that night as I lay in bed, replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Alina since she married my dad. I remembered the look on her face when Dad told her he had updated his will to protect my share of everything they owned jointly. She had smiled, but her knuckles were white as she gripped her wine glass, saying how families should trust each other completely. Even back then, her phrasing of trust felt like a threat, but I was too young to understand why. Ava arrived at my door 3 days later with her laptop and a flash drive. It contained photos from Dad's funeral. She had been in the parking lot during the reception I was banned from and had seen Alina meeting with Adrian Vance behind the dumpsters. The timestamp on the photos read 2:47 p.m., while everyone else was inside eating finger sandwiches and sharing memories I wasn't allowed to hear. In the photos, Adrian was waving his arms and pointing at Alina, and she was holding up her hands as if trying to calm him down. In one shot, his face was contorted with rage, and for the first time I'd ever seen, Alina looked afraid. 3 weeks after her initial call, Maria texted me in a panic. The medical board had called her in for a formal interview that morning. By lunchtime, she had been suspended from her job, pending an internal investigation into patient confidentiality breaches and improper access to medical records. She was sobbing when she called, saying she couldn't afford to lose her job and her nursing license over this. Rowan immediately drove to the hospital with paperwork for a whistleblower protection claim, arguing that her suspension was an illegal act of retaliation for exposing potential patient harm. He also served subpoenas for all patient records, where Adrian Vance was the attending physician, and Alina was listed as the family contact or healthcare proxy. The next morning, Ava called and asked me to come over, saying she'd found some old photo albums from family parties. I drove to her cozy kitchen, where she had boxes spread across the table. We started flipping through photos from 2 years earlier, when Dad was still vibrant and healthy. Ava pointed to a picture of him carrying her daughter on his shoulders at a birthday party. "He should have had 10 more good years, at least," she said quietly. I nodded, continuing to turn the pages until my phone rang with Dorian's name on the screen. His voice was different this time, sober and scared, not drunk and angry. He told me his mother had been frantically moving money between different bank accounts all week. He'd overheard her on the phone talking about Adrian's plan falling apart and the need to cover their tracks. He was beginning to realize his mother was involved in something truly terrible. I told him to write down everything he remembered and called Rowan's office immediately. 2 days later, I met Maria at a park near the hospital. She broke down in tears, repeating that she couldn't afford to lose her nursing license or her job with 3 kids at home. I promised her that I would cover all of her legal fees and any lost wages that resulted from this nightmare. I told her my father would have wanted the truth to come out, no matter the cost. She wiped her eyes, hugged me, and walked back to her car with a renewed sense of determination. Rowan called me from his office that afternoon, sounding angry for the first time since I'd known him. Elinor's lawyer had sent him a cease and desist letter, threatening a defamation lawsuit if I continued to spread what they called malicious falsehoods. That same day, Rowan filed a formal criminal complaint with the Milwaukee Police Department. The threat, he said, just proved they were scared, and we were on the right path. After nearly a month of paperwork and waiting, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The woman introduced herself as Detective Miller from the Milwaukee Police Department's Financial Crimes Division. She wanted to schedule an interview regarding my father's death and the allegations we had made. A formal investigation into suspected medical fraud and elder abuse at the hospital was officially underway, she said. They would be contacting everyone involved for statements. 3 nights later, a knock on my door around 11 p.m. made me jump, as I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, I saw Lyra, looking terrified and glancing over her shoulder. The moment I opened the door, she practically fell inside, words tumbling out of her mouth about her mother. She had overheard Elinor on the phone with Adrian, discussing how to tie up loose ends before the investigation got any deeper. Lyra was convinced her mother would target her next because she knew too much about their relationship. I grabbed my keys and drove her straight to Rowan's office, even though it was nearly midnight. He met us there and took Lyra's official statement, during which she revealed everything she knew about her mother's schemes. She explained that Elinor had been using her old nursing textbooks to research specific drugs and their interactions. This research had started months before my father even got sick, which made everything feel so much colder. Lyra provided us with photos she'd taken of her mother's handwritten notes on medication dosages and interaction effects. The following week, Detective Miller called Adrian Vance down to the station for questioning. According to the report, Adrian was visibly nervous, constantly wiping sweat from his brow. He insisted Elinor was just a loving wife making routine medical choices for her ailing husband. But when the detective pressed him about the pattern of similar deaths and his long-standing association with Elinor, he couldn't provide a straight answer. He kept changing his story and contradicting himself. Meanwhile, I went to the storage unit where I'd kept Dad's things after selling the house. I found a journal he had been keeping during his final months, something I never knew existed. His handwriting grew shakier with each passing page as he described feeling fuzzy, and disoriented after Aliner's visits. He wrote about wondering if his medications were right, questioning why he always felt worse after she helped him take his pills. Lyra showing up at 11 p.m. with dirt on her own mother elevates family drama to Olympic levels. Most kids are stealing the car keys. She's out here collecting evidence of murder plots like they're Pokémon cards. Reading his conflicted thoughts about trusting the woman he loved, while suspecting something was terribly wrong, made me feel sick to my stomach. The next day, Rowan got a call from Maria's lawyer with incredible news. 2 other nurses from the hospital had come forward to them with similar concerns about Adrian. They had been too afraid to speak up before, but Maria's courage had inspired them. After that, the investigation accelerated, and Rowan suggested we meet with the detective again to review everything we now had. 6 weeks had passed since that first phone call from the hospital, and I was starting to feel like we were finally making progress. Then I ran into Aliner at a grocery store near my new house. I was loading bags into my car when I heard her voice right behind me. My blood ran cold. She was standing between 2 cars, blocking my path, and her face looked different, thinner, older, harder. She stepped closer, and I could smell that same expensive perfume she always wore, but now it just made me want to be sick. "You have no idea what you're destroying," she said, her voice a low hiss that was nothing like her public persona. Without thinking, I pulled out my phone and started recording, holding it down by my side but making sure the camera was pointed at her. She kept talking, saying that my father was going to die anyway, and that this way, it meant something, whatever that was supposed to mean. Her hands were shaking, and she kept glancing around as if terrified someone would see us together. I told her to get away from me, but she grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to leave marks. When another shopper walked by and asked if everything was all right, Aliner instantly let go, plastering on her best fake smile. She walked away quickly, but not before warning me that I would regret this, that I didn't understand what I was meddling in. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't drive home. I called Rowan immediately and told him what happened. He told me to come to his office right away, and we played the recording for Detective Miller, who listened to it 3 times before calling for backup. The detective said that Aliner had essentially confessed on tape, and an arrest warrant would be issued immediately. 2 officers went to her house that afternoon, but she was already gone. Her car was in the driveway, and neighbors reported seeing her load suitcases into a taxi earlier that morning, right before she confronted me at the store. The inside of the house was a wreck, with drawers pulled open and clothes scattered everywhere, as if she had packed in a blind panic. Dorian called me that night, sobbing, a sound I had never heard from him. His mother had drained their joint bank account and left him a text message saying she would be in touch once things settled down. She had taken everything, including money from his sister Lyra's college fund, and had simply vanished without a word to her own children about where she was going. He kept repeating that he couldn't believe she would abandon them like that. But I wasn't surprised. Aliner had only ever cared about herself. The medical board, alerted by the police investigation, began looking into Adrian's other cases, and what they uncovered turned everyone's stomach. Over a 5-year period, they identified 17 other patients who had died under suspicious circumstances, and every single one had money and a connection to either Aliner or Adrian. Some were Aliner's friends from the country club, Others were Adrian's own patients who had been referred from other doctors. The pattern was identical. Medications altered just before death, and family members kept at a distance during their final days. On paper, each death looked natural, but when viewed together, it painted a picture of something monstrous. 2 months had passed since that first call from Maria when I finally visited Dad's grave for the first time since the funeral I was forbidden from attending. I had been avoiding it, not sure I could handle the emotion, but I needed to tell him what was happening. The cemetery was quiet, and I sat on the cold ground, talking to his headstone, updating him on the investigation and promising that I would get justice for him. Ava arrived while I was there. She must have known I'd finally worked up the courage to come, because she just sat down beside me without a word. We held each other, and I cried harder than I had since the day he died, finally letting myself feel the grief I had been bottling up while fighting Alina. Rowan called me into his office the following week. The FBI had joined the investigation now that Alina had crossed state lines, and they suspected interstate fraud was involved. They told us she had been tracked to a hotel in Chicago, but she was using a fake ID, and they were still trying to pinpoint her exact location. The agent assured me it was only a matter of time, but I could tell they were frustrated that she had gotten such a head start. Adrian Vance was arrested that same day in the hospital lobby, in front of his colleagues and patients. They charged him with medical fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. Maria was watching from across the lobby as they put him in handcuffs. She said she felt a sad sort of vindication, because the whole situation was a betrayal of everything doctors were supposed to represent. The investigation exploded, and 17 families ultimately joined a massive civil lawsuit against the hospital, Adrian, and Alina. Rowan and I spent hours reviewing all the case files. The hospital's insurance company was already pushing for a settlement, knowing how damning it would all look in court. Lyra contacted Rowan's office one day and asked for a meeting. She brought a laptop filled with emails between her mother and Adrian. They had been using the code phrase, the Milwaukee Protocol, for their scheme, and she had dozens of messages where they discussed which patients to target and how to split the proceeds. The detectives granted her immunity in exchange for her full cooperation, and she seemed relieved to finally unburden herself of the truth. I wasn't sleeping or eating much anymore. I kept double-checking the locks on my doors, paranoid that Alina would somehow find my new home, even though the FBI assured me she was hundreds of miles away. 3 days later, Rowan called me at 6 a.m., his voice electric with excitement. The FBI had caught Alina at Chicago's O'Hare Airport, trying to board a flight to Costa Rica with a forged passport and $90,000 in cash. They pulled her off the plane in handcuffs while other passengers filmed it on their phones. Within 12 hours, she was back in Milwaukee, sitting in a holding cell at the county jail. A judge set her bail at $2 million, which she couldn't possibly pay. They charged her with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of financial fraud totaling over $300,000. I watched the news report from my couch, my hands shaking every time they showed her mugshot. 2 weeks later, I had to see her in person at her arraignment. The courthouse was a media circus, and I wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Alina walked into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, her hands shackled in front of her. She looked 20 years older, with gray roots showing in her perfectly coiffed hair and deep lines etched around her mouth. Her expensive lawyer stood beside her as the judge read out the charges. Alina kept her chin held high, staring straight ahead as if she were at a board meeting instead of facing life in prison. When the judge asked for her plea, she said not guilty in a clear, defiant voice that made my stomach churn. I noticed she was still wearing my dad's wedding ring and the diamond earrings he had given her for their anniversary. After the hearing, Dorian and Lyra were waiting for me in the hallway. They both looked terrible, with dark circles under their eyes. Dorian's hands were shaking even more than mine. Lyra started to cry before she could even speak, so Dorian spoke for both of them. He apologized for everything, for how they had treated me, for taking Alina's side, for blowing through Dad's money like it was their own. They said they wanted to testify against their mother and would do whatever it took to return any money left from the estate. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and walked away. Rowan called the next morning. Adrian Vance's lawyer wanted to meet about a potential plea deal. We met in Rowan's conference room that afternoon. The other lawyer was a young guy who was sweating through his suit. He said Adrian was willing to testify against Alina in exchange for a reduced sentence, 5 to 10 years instead of 25 to life. He claimed Alina was the mastermind who had seduced Adrian and then blackmailed him over gambling debts he owed to the wrong people. Adrian would provide emails, text messages, and recordings of their conversations where they planned everything. Rowan looked at me, waiting for my decision. I wanted them both to rot in prison forever, but Rowan gently explained that without Adrian's testimony, convicting Alina on the murder charge, rather than just negligence, would be much harder. My fists were clenched so tightly under the table my knuckles were white. I could barely breathe, picturing Dad dying alone while they were counting their money. Rowan said we didn't have to decide right away, but the offer was only on the table for 48 hours. I went home and was sick twice before calling Rowan back and accepting the deal. 3 months of depositions, evidence reviews, and motion hearings passed in a blur. The pre-trial hearing was on a Tuesday morning, and Alina's lawyer tried to get the whole case thrown out. He stood there arguing about circumstantial evidence, chain of custody, and reasonable doubt while Alina sat motionless in her chair. In response, the prosecutor wheeled out 8 boxes of evidence and set them on the table, filled with medical records, financial statements, and a timeline proving Alina and Adrian were together the night my dad died. The judge spent an hour reviewing everything while we sat in tense silence. Alina's grocery store confrontation seems curiously timed. She's on the verge of fleeing, but makes a special stop to threaten me first. Her comment about Dad's death, meaning something, makes me wonder what kind of twisted logic she's using to justify it all. When he finally spoke, he denied the motion, stating there was more than sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The color drained from Alina's face, and she grabbed her lawyer's arm so hard he winced. That same week, Maria called to tell me she was back at work, having won her wrongful termination suit against the hospital. They had to give her a $200,000 settlement and promote her to head of patient advocacy. She said the hospital had implemented new oversight protocols and had fired 3 other administrators who were complicit in the cover-up. She thanked me for standing by her when no one else would. A week later, I met with the prosecution's expert witness, a toxicologist from Johns Hopkins who specialized in medication interactions. We sat in a sterile conference room as he went through Dad's medical charts page by page, explaining what each medication did. He showed how the combination of drugs they gave Dad would, without a doubt, cause his liver and kidneys to shut down in a matter of hours. The dosages were 3 times the normal limit and were combined with drugs that should never be given together. He said it was a near-certain method to induce organ failure, and whoever ordered it knew exactly what they were doing. Each page felt like another knife in my chest as I watched Dad's vitals plummet while they kept pumping him full of poison. Ava called me that night in tears. She had been going through her father's old computer and found something. There were emails from 2 years prior where my uncle expressed concern that Alina was having an affair with someone he called Dr. A. The emails were dated around the same time. Alina and Adrian were serving on that charity board together. My uncle wrote that he had seen them at a hotel restaurant when Alina had told Dad she was visiting her sister in Phoenix. He never told Dad because he didn't have concrete proof and didn't want to cause trouble. The next morning, Alina's lawyer called Rowan. His client wanted to make a deal. Alina would tell me Dad's true final words and explain what really happened that night if I agreed to drop the criminal charges. Rowan put the call on speaker, and I could hear the desperation in the lawyer's voice. I told him to tell Alina she could take her offer and go to hell. I already knew what she did to my dad. The lawyer tried to protest, but Rowan hung up on him. 2 days later, Rowan called and told me to come to the district attorney's office immediately. I drove downtown to find the building swarming with reporters who shoved microphones in my face as I pushed my way through. Inside a conference room, 3 federal prosecutors sat with boxes of files stacked on the table. The lead prosecutor, a woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, spread out documents linking Alina's name to hospitals in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. She pointed to dates going back 7 years. They had uncovered 17 other families just like mine. Each case had the same pattern. An elderly individual dying suddenly while Alina or Adrian oversaw their care. The FBI was now treating this as an organized criminal enterprise, and RICO charges were being filed. I left that meeting feeling sick, but also grimly satisfied that Dad was not her only victim. The following week, I found myself sitting in a circle of folding chairs in a community center, listening to strangers tell stories that were eerily similar to my own. A woman named Miriam wept as she described how her mother's nurse, a close friend of Alina's, wouldn't let her visit during her final days. A man named Gareth showed us an obituary where his stepmother had written him out, just like Alina had done to me. We started meeting every Tuesday. I began bringing coffee and donuts because these were the only people who truly understood what I was going through. 4 months after that first call from the hospital, Rowan called me into his office to discuss a settlement offer. The hospital, desperate to avoid a public trial, was offering $8 million to be divided among the 17 families. I stared at the number on the paper, and my stomach twisted. No amount of money could ever bring Dad back. Rowan gave me 48 hours to decide. I spent those 2 days pacing my house, unable to eat or sleep. In the end, I agreed, because the other families deserved closure, and some of them had mountains of medical debt from trying to save their loved ones. Adrian gave his deposition the following week in a room with 2 stenographers and 5 lawyers. He sat there in his orange jumpsuit, calmly explaining how Alina would scout targets at charity galas and hospital fundraisers. She looked for wealthy widowers or men with strained family relationships, people she could easily isolate from their children. My dad, he explained, was a perfect target because of our pre-existing tension and his guilt over not standing up to her. Adrian detailed their system. Alina would advocate for specific drugs to keep the patients confused, while Adrian would alter the medical records to make the deaths look natural. Lyra called me one afternoon, crying. She had discovered something horrible. Her mother had given her bank account numbers years ago, telling her they were for emergencies. Lyra had just discovered that Alina was accessing them from jail using a contraband phone. She had already tried to transfer $200,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands. Lyra drove straight to the police station and handed over everything, including passwords and routing numbers Alina had hidden inside a recipe box. Detective Miller praised her courage and immediately alerted the FBI, who froze the accounts within hours. Forensic accountants found over $3 million spread across 12 different offshore accounts, all funded by Alina's previous victims. The authorities seized every last penny and began the process of returning it to the families she had robbed. On a whim, I decided to drive by Dad's old house, even though strangers lived there now. The new owners, a young couple with a baby, were kind enough to let me walk through the rooms where I grew up. I stood in Dad's study, where he used to help me with my homework, and realized I had been so focused on getting justice that I had never truly allowed myself to just grieve. The woman made me a cup of tea and let me sit in the backyard where Dad and I used to grill burgers on Sundays. I sat on their patio furniture and cried for an hour while they pretended to be busy inside. A few weeks later, Dorian called to tell me he'd gotten a job loading trucks at a warehouse. He had never worked a day in his life, but he said he needed to do something honest after years of living off his mother's stolen money. We met for coffee, and he apologized for the years he spent treating me like I was nothing. He showed me his first paycheck and said he was saving up to help repay some of the families his mother had victimized. I didn't forgive him completely, but I was glad to see he was trying to be a better man. The prosecution uncovered more evidence. 3 life insurance policies Alina had taken out on my dad without his knowledge. Each policy was worth between $1 and $2 million, and all were taken out within a year of his death. The insurance companies had already paid out, but were now suing to get their money back on the grounds of fraud. 2 weeks before the trial, the judge held a hearing on a motion from Alina's lawyer to move the trial to a different county. Her lawyer argued that the media coverage made it impossible to find an impartial jury in our area. The judge, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked directly at Alina and said that she had created this situation through her own greed and cruelty. He denied the motion and set jury selection to begin on Monday morning. I spent the next 3 days in Rowan's office on the 3rd floor of an old brick building downtown, trying to write my victim impact statement. I sat at his conference table with a legal pad, crossing out sentence after sentence, while Rowan reviewed case files across from me. Every time I tried to put into words what Alina had done, the words felt hollow, inadequate to describe the sheer scale of the damage she had caused. I wrote about being locked out of Dad's hospital room while he was dying. I wrote about the funeral I wasn't allowed to attend and the obituary that erased me from his life. I wrote about the horror of learning she had been poisoning him with morphine. Rowan looked up as I crumpled another draft and threw it in the trash. He told me, "Just write what you would want to say to your dad if he could hear you." That was the key. By Thursday afternoon, I had 3 paragraphs that made my hands shake to read aloud. Marisol came to my apartment on Friday morning with coffee and a folder full of medical charts. She sat on my sofa and spread the documents out on my coffee table, pointing to dates and dosage amounts she had circled in red ink. The prosecutor had asked her to testify about the patterns she had observed in Dad's final weeks. She said preparing for this had changed her, made her question every order she ever followed at work. We both knew we would never be the same people we were before Alina. That weekend, I finally opened the last box of Dad's things from the storage unit. Most of it was old tax returns and appliance manuals he'd held onto for years. But at the very bottom was a shoebox filled with cards and letters, some addressed to me but never sent. One envelope had my name on it in his shaky handwriting, dated 1 month before he died. Inside, he had written that he was sorry he hadn't done more to protect me from Alina, that he knew she was driving a wedge between us but felt too weak to fight her. He wrote that he loved me and that he wished he'd had the courage to stand up to her while he still had the chance. I sat on my bedroom floor, holding that letter and crying until the ink began to bleed from my tears. Adrian had been attacked in the county jail. The report came over Rowan's office phone on Monday morning. Another inmate, whose own mother had died from medical malpractice, had cornered him in the showers with a sharpened toothbrush. Adrian survived, but he needed surgery for a lacerated liver and was in serious condition at the very same hospital where Dad had died. The prosecution called Rowan to discuss if Adrian's videotaped deposition could be used if he was unable to testify in person. The judge's denial of Alina's motion for a change of venue, because she created the situation through her own greed and cruelty, is the legal equivalent of telling someone, "You made your bed, now you get to rot in it." Detective Miller stopped by that afternoon with more chilling news about Alina's plans. They had found emails on her laptop indicating she had already selected her next target, an 82-year-old widower from the country club named Leonard Voss. She had offered to help plan his granddaughter's wedding and had been meeting him twice a week for coffee, telling him how lonely she was after losing her own husband. Leonard's daughter had called the police after seeing Alina's arrest on the news and recognizing her from the wedding planning meetings. The detective said Alina had been following the exact same pattern: ingratiate herself with the family, make herself indispensable, and present herself as a loving companion. It all came crashing down on me on Sunday night, the eve of the trial. Ava found me on my bathroom floor at 2 a.m., unable to breathe, feeling like an elephant was sitting on my chest. She helped me to the couch and sat with me as I gasped and trembled, talking me through my breaths. She stayed up with me until the sun came up, making tea and telling me Dad would be so proud of what I was doing. She said he would want me to be strong in that courtroom and tell the truth about what Alina did. When we arrived at the courthouse on Monday morning for the first day of the trial, it was a chaotic scene of reporters and cameras. The prosecutor, Helena Vargas, a formidable woman with streaks of silver in her dark hair, stood for opening statements. She told the jury they were about to hear evidence of a calculated murder disguised as medical care. She painted a picture of Alina as a predator who isolated a dying man from his daughter, manipulated his medications, and stole not just his money, but his final moments with his family. Alina's lawyer, a slick man in a tailored suit who kept checking his phone, argued that Alina was a devoted wife making tough medical choices for her terminally ill husband. He claimed the prosecution was trying to criminalize compassion, and that Alina's only crime was loving a man whose own daughter had abandoned him. I had to dig my fingernails into my palms to keep from standing up and screaming. On Tuesday, it was my turn to testify. My legs were shaking as I walked to the witness stand. Alina stared at me the whole time, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line, trying to intimidate me. Helena asked me about the funeral. I described getting the call telling me I was banned, driving to Alina's house, and being told security would be called if I showed up. I told them about the obituary that named Alina's children, but not me, how I was erased from my own father's life story while his body was still warm. One of the jurors wiped a tear from her eye as I read the letter Dad had written, apologizing for not protecting me from Alina. When Alina's lawyer cross-examined me, he tried to paint me as a bitter daughter, angry about the will and out for revenge, but I stayed calm and stuck to the facts. Marisol took the stand on Wednesday afternoon, wheeling in a cart loaded with medical charts and documents. She walked the jury through each morphine dose, showing how the levels escalated whenever Alina was alone with Dad. She pointed to her own notes in the margins where she had questioned the dosages, only to be overruled by Dr. Vance. Alina's lawyer tried to portray her as a disgruntled employee with a grudge against hospital administration, but Marisol's meticulous documentation spoke louder than his accusations. She had kept copies of everything, taken photos of medication logs, and even recorded phone calls with Dr. Vance where he ordered her to increase the morphine despite Dad's stable condition. The court called for a recess after Marisol's testimony. When we returned 3 days later, TV screens were set up for Adrian to testify from his hospital bed. He looked ghastly, with tubes coming out of his arms and a neck brace holding his head still. The prosecutor asked him to describe what happened to my father and the other patients. Adrian began slowly, his voice raspy over the video link. He described how Alina would come to his office with cookies and coffee, asking questions about pain management protocols and end-of-life care, always under the guise of being a concerned wife. He said she knew exactly which drugs would accelerate organ failure without setting off alarm bells. She sought out combinations that would mimic a natural decline in a very sick patient. Suddenly, Alina jumped up from her chair and screamed, "He's lying. He's trying to save himself." The judge slammed his gavel and warned her lawyer to control his client, or she would be removed from the courtroom. Adrian continued his testimony, describing how Alina would put on a show of crying in his office about how much Dad was suffering. She would beg him to increase the morphine, insisting Dad was in agony, even when the nurses reported that he was resting comfortably. The next witness was Lyra. I couldn't imagine what it took for her to testify against her own mother. She walked to the stand without once looking at Alina, her hands shaking as she took the oath. Lyra told the court about growing up with Alina's obsession with money and status. She described how her mother would practice crying in front of a mirror to get the right look for any given situation. Lyra had walked in on Alina on the morning of Dad's funeral, rehearsing her grief-stricken widow expression. When caught, Eleanor had laughed and said she needed to look good for the cameras because some distant cousins were wealthy. During the lunch recess, I went to the restroom and found Eleanor there, touching up her lipstick. She turned to me and said, "You know, your father asked for those medications. He said he'd rather die than keep living with a daughter who abandoned him." I knew it was a desperate, cruel manipulation, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. I just washed my hands and walked out without a word. That night, I sat with Ava at my kitchen table, going through Dad's journal again, which the police had returned to me. We found an entry from 2 months before he died where he wrote about being afraid of Eleanor. He said she was becoming someone he didn't recognize, cold and calculating. He wrote that he wished I could visit more without it causing a fight, that he missed our Sunday breakfasts. The prosecution brought in a financial expert the next morning who traced Eleanor's offshore accounts. The jurors leaned forward as he displayed charts showing money moving through shell corporations for 3 years before Dad even got sick. He explained how Eleanor researched each victim's family situation, seeking out parents with strained relationships with their children. She had deliberately chosen patients whose families were unlikely to ask difficult questions about their deaths. 2 days later, it was the defense's turn to call witnesses. Most of them were members of Eleanor's book club and charity committees. They all testified that she was a devoted wife who constantly spoke of Dad's care and comfort. But under cross-examination by the prosecutor, each one admitted they had never actually seen Eleanor with Dad. They had only heard her stories over lunches and at meetings. They had never witnessed their actual dynamic. One woman even admitted that Eleanor had asked her to testify in exchange for a large donation to her favorite charity. Then, Eleanor took the stand herself and gave the performance of her life. She wept, she wailed, she spoke of being tormented by a jealous stepdaughter who had always hated her. She claimed I was angry about the will and was trying to destroy her out of pure spite. But when the prosecutor started asking specific questions, her story unraveled. She couldn't explain the offshore accounts or why she was researching those specific medications. She contradicted herself about Dad's condition, at one point saying he was in excruciating pain, and at another saying he was peaceful. The prosecutor produced text messages from Adrian's phone where she wrote about wanting to speed things up. During cross-examination, they played the audio I had recorded in the grocery store parking lot, where she all but confessed. Eleanor claimed I had edited it, taken her words out of context, but a forensic expert had already testified that the recording was authentic and unaltered. Finally, Eleanor admitted she had said those things, but claimed she was just upset and exaggerating. After her testimony, I couldn't sit in the courtroom anymore. I went outside and sat on the steps. Rowan found me there with my head in my hands, trying to process it all. He reminded me that no matter what the verdict was, I had already won by bringing the truth to light. He told me 3 other families had come forward after seeing the news coverage, with suspicions about their own loved ones' deaths. We had stopped her from hurting anyone else, and that was more important than any verdict. Dorian was the last witness that day. It was painful to watch him take the stand. He looked like a broken man, nothing like the arrogant kid who used to sneer at me at family dinners. He testified about finding the documents his mother tried to burn after my dad died. He testified about her relationship with Adrian, how they had been meeting secretly for months before my dad got sick. Dorian broke down on the stand and apologized to me, saying he should have seen what she was doing. He said he was too focused on the money she was giving him to ever question where it came from. The next morning, the prosecutor stood for his closing arguments. He walked slowly to the jury box, rested his hands on the rail, and looked at each juror one by one. He pulled out a large folder and began arranging exhibits on a board. My father's hospital charts, the bank statements showing the money transfers, the text messages between Alina and Adrian they had recovered from her deleted files. He pointed to each piece of evidence, weaving a narrative of how Alina planned everything, how she slowly increased Dad's medication, how she made sure she was the one administering it, and how Adrian altered the records to cover her tracks. The prosecutor's voice rose as he spoke of the other families, showing photos of 3 other elderly patients who had died under nearly identical circumstances with Alina at their side. All of them had left behind money that somehow ended up in her accounts. Adrian's testimony from his hospital bed makes me wonder what actually happened to land him there. The story mentions tubes and a neck brace but doesn't detail his injuries. Alina's lawyer stood up next, adjusted his tie, and sauntered over to the jury. He argued that the entire case was built on coincidence and that Alina was an easy target because people didn't like her personality. He claimed Adrian was trying to save himself by blaming Alina, that there was no hard proof she had administered any incorrect medication, and that being a bad stepmother didn't make you a murderer. The jury went out to deliberate. I found myself in the courthouse waiting room, with Ava holding my hand and Rowan checking his phone every few minutes. A little while later, Dorian and Lyra came in and sat across from us. None of us spoke, but we were all waiting for the same thing. I couldn't sit still anymore, so I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried. I knelt at his gravestone, tracing his name in the cold granite with my fingertips. I told him about the trial, about finding the strength to fight Alina, and that I hoped, wherever he was, he could see what was happening. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the oak trees overhead, and I let myself believe he was listening. 2 days passed with no word. Then the bailiff called us back to the courtroom. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. The foreman stood, his hands shaking slightly as he held a piece of paper. "Guilty," he read, his voice clear and steady. "On all counts. Murder, conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, elder abuse." Alina crumpled in her chair, and her lawyer had to grab her arm to keep her from falling. The judge banged his gavel and announced that sentencing would be in 6 weeks, ordering Alina to be held without bail. 2 officers came forward with handcuffs. She locked eyes with me, her face a mask of pure hatred, but she didn't say a word. Outside the courthouse, the families of the other victims surrounded me. An elderly woman grabbed my hands, thanking me through her tears. A middle-aged man said I had gotten justice for his mother. Reporters shoved microphones at me, but I just shook my head and said, "The verdict speaks for itself." That night, I cooked pasta for Ava, Marisol, and Rowan at my place. We raised glasses of wine to my dad's memory and to justice being served. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I took a deep breath and didn't feel like my chest was being crushed. A week later, I was in the same courtroom for Adrian's sentencing. I watched as the judge gave him 15 years with the possibility of parole in 7. He was also ordered to pay restitution to all the victims' families. It didn't feel like enough for what he'd done, but it was something. 6 weeks after the verdict, I stood at a podium in the packed courtroom for Alina's sentencing hearing. My hands gripped the sides as I looked at her, sitting there in an orange jumpsuit, her hands chained to the table. I spoke about losing my father, about being banned from his funeral, about having my last chance to say goodbye stolen from me. I spoke of the months of pain and grief, made so much worse by her cruelty. My voice broke as I described the horror of finding out he was murdered by the person who was supposed to love him. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of quiet weeping from the gallery. Dorian had his head in his hands. Even the court reporter had to pause and wipe her eyes. Then the next family got up, an older man with trembling hands. He talked about his wife dying alone, while Alina was cashing the insurance policy she'd taken out on her without his knowledge. Another woman described finding morphine missing from her mother's hospice supplies, the same drugs that killed her mother weeks before doctors had predicted. Family after family told the same story, loved ones dying too soon, too conveniently, and always with Alina benefiting from a new insurance policy or a last-minute change to a will. Alina sat stone-faced through it all, not even flinching when one man broke down sobbing about his brother's last days. The prosecution put up bank records on the screen, with deposit dates that lined up perfectly with the death dates of 14 victims over 8 years. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was like steel. He called her crimes the most profound betrayal of trust I have seen in 30 years on the bench. He said she had weaponized caregiving and turned it into an instrument of calculated murder. For the first time, Alina's composure cracked and raw terror showed on her face. The judge delivered the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole on all 14 counts to be served consecutively. She would die in prison, even if she lived to be 200. Alina leaped to her feet, screaming that I had ruined her life, that it was all my fault. But the bailiffs grabbed her arms and dragged her out as she shrieked my name. A long, heavy silence filled the courtroom after the doors slammed shut behind her. Outside, the other families gathered around me. We were all bound together by this shared horror. They were starting a nonprofit to advocate for better oversight of medical proxies, and they wanted me on the board. They said my courage to speak up had saved other people's lives. I said yes without hesitation, knowing it was what Dad would have wanted, for some good to come from all this pain. 3 weeks later, Ava helped me clear out the storage unit where I'd put Dad's things after the house sold. His old toolbox was in the corner, the one he'd used to teach me how to use a hammer when I was 7. I thought I would cry, but instead, I just felt ready to let go of what didn't matter and keep what did. We donated his tools to a local trade school he'd always supported. I kept his watch and a few photos and gave his clothes to a charity. 2 months after the sentencing, Dorian texted and asked if we could get coffee. He and Lyra looked healthier than I had ever seen them. Both were in therapy, trying to put their lives back together. Lyra was going back to nursing school, paying her own way with a job she'd gotten. Dorian had been saving up for his own apartment. They apologized again for not seeing their mother for who she was. They said they would understand if I never wanted to see them again, but as I looked at them, trying so hard to be better, I realized they were victims in their own way, too. The hospital settlement came through the next month. Each family received compensation for their loss. I used my portion to fully endow the foundation we had started, and to create a nursing scholarship in my dad's name at the local college. The scholarship would be for students who demonstrated a commitment to ethical patient care, for kids who understood that caring for the vulnerable is a sacred trust. Marisol called me, crying, after the hospital named her the director of their new elder care oversight program, which they created in the wake of the scandal. She promised she would honor my dad and all the others by making sure no caregiver could ever do what Alina did again. By Thanksgiving, my life had found a new, quiet rhythm. I hosted dinner at my house for Ava's family, Marisol, and, surprisingly, Dorian and Lyra, who brought a homemade pie. We raised our glasses to the people we had lost and to the strange, new family we had built from the ashes of shared grief. No one said Alina's name. A week before Christmas, a letter arrived from the state prison. It had Alina's inmate number on it. I recognized her handwriting and knew, without opening it, that this was one last attempt to manipulate me, probably to ask for money or to try to make me feel guilty. I read only the first line, where she wrote that I owed her an apology. I walked over to my fireplace, struck a match, and watched her words turn to ash. The last of her power over me went up the chimney with the smoke. Spring came early that year, and I finally felt ready to plant the memorial garden I had been planning. I bought Dad's favorite flowers, the yellow roses he had planted at our old house before Alina made him rip them out because she was allergic. As I worked the soil with my own new tools, not the ones we donated, but ones I had bought for myself, I thought about how Alina had stolen his last moments, but she couldn't steal what really mattered. She couldn't take the Saturday mornings when Dad taught me how to change the oil in the car, or the way he beamed at my college graduation, or the time he told me I was his greatest accomplishment, even as Alina rolled her eyes. Every spring, that garden would bloom, a testament to the fact that the truth can always find its way through even the darkest soil. Dad would have liked that. He would have liked knowing that in the end, love and justice won.